This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. I welcome Eric Berger. His new book, very important to understand, Liftoff, is the Elon Musk in the desperate early days that launched SpaceX. It is March 2006. We are on Omelok Island, part of the Marshall Atolls, the Kwajalein Atolls, part of the Marshall Chain string in the Pacific. We are standing there waiting for a rocket called Falcon 1 to launch. Why we're there and who is there to watch this are the critical ways to understand SpaceX's success. Eric, congratulations and a very good evening to you. Thank you for this. March 2006. What am I looking at, that rocket raised out there called Falcon 1? What is riding on this launch and who is watching it? Good evening to you.
Good evening. This is the very first test launch of a SpaceX rocket. The company has put 4 years. They've gone as fast as they can, and they've reached this island in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific Ocean to try to reach orbit on their very first attempt. And so it's a skinny black and white rocket, several stories tall with a single main engine and an upper stage, and they're about to ignite that engine.
They're about to ignite an engine called Merlin. And what I learned from you, Eric, is that space exploration comes down to an engine. That's it. Everything else you can add on, but you must build the engine. And that engine right now is to be tested in flight for the first time, watching both at Omelok and back at Kwajalein, the army base that extends through all these atolls, and then back in California are the gathering of heroes, the band of brothers and sisters who are SpaceX. This is a private enterprise. So why have they come 5,000 miles from California to launch a rocket? Why didn't they do this back in California, Eric?
Right. So all the key people are, in fact, in Kwajalein, several miles away from Omelok watching. Elon Musk is there. This is before he's famous, before he's controversial as he is today. And the key people he's hired at the company, and they're in Kwajalein because they could not go fast enough in California. They had a launch site a couple hours north of their factory in Los Angeles, and the Air Force basically said, you've got to wait for these other rockets to launch, and there's more important customers, and the National Reconnaissance Office has a spy satellite to go, and so you got to wait your turn. And Elon Musk wasn't going to wait his turn because no one was paying him to launch this rocket. Time was money. And so they made what might be seen as a rash decision to pick up their entire launch apparatus, go 4,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean. So you fly to Hawaii and then fly that distance again to get to Kwajalein, and there they are.
And they are watching for this rocket to take off because the first stage engine, Merlin, has been road tested at their facility in Texas. The second stage, Kestrel, the first stage has to work before we know whether Kestrel, the second stage, the upper stage, and does it have a satellite on it? What is it that they hope to get into orbit that day?
They have a small satellite built by the Air Force Academy. That is basically a test satellite that the students have built. DARPA, the defense agency, is paying SpaceX a few $1 million to launch this into orbit, basically to help provide them some money to get off the ground. And so, there's the Air Force captain is there. It's in March, and they're going to see if it goes to orbit.
Some of the personalities watching this launch. Who is Hans Königsmann? What is his job that day?
Hans Königsmann is a German who found himself in America about a decade earlier. And his job is to make sure the avionics, so the flight software, the flight computers on board, all the wiring and stuff, to make sure that's all done right. Because once you light a rocket's engine, you don't have any more control over it. The computer on board takes over.
And Jeremy Holman, who is he that day?
He's the chief lieutenant to Tom Mueller. Tom Mueller is basically Elon's right-hand man. He's in charge of propulsion. So Mueller built the engine, and Jerry Holman was basically his key lieutenant. He led a lot of the testing, did a lot of the work on the engine. And so he has probably had his hands on this rocket the most out of anyone there.
And Tim Buzza, what's his job that day?
Tim Buzza is the launch director. So he's seated in the small control center on Kwajalein atoll, right next to Elon, and sort of helping to lead the countdown.
And Chenery, US Air Force veteran.
Ann Chenery was she was the launch conductor, so she was actually sending commands to and from the rocket. She had a background in the Air Force, and when she was in her 30s, decided she wanted actually a little more excitement than that, and so she went for a startup rocket company.
And they're watching this liftoff, having checked it. They load the locks. It's a kerosene and liquid oxygen liftoff. And they need to actually see it fly. It's not good enough for the test to work at McGregor. It's not good enough for it to work on a computer. It starts lifting off. I have seconds. They notice on what they're watching it on a video screen. Is that correct, Eric?
Yes.
So they see everything as the rocket takes off. They notice that there's something that rocketry calls an anomaly. There's a flash or a piece of smoke or some flame coming out. What are they seeing? Chris Thompson, I think, sees it first.
Yeah, so obviously you want the engine to ignite. That's actually a pretty big challenge, getting a rocket engine to ignite right when you want it to. And so you want to see some fire, but they also saw fire on the side of the engine. And so that was not good. They could see right away that the engine was on fire, and the hope was, what Musk told me later, was they hoped that maybe if the rocket climbed high enough, there wouldn't be enough ambient oxygen in the atmosphere, and that fire would go out on the engine.
However, they didn't make it. So the engine burns and the rocket goes out of control. And does it come apart in the sky? I don't think it reaches escape velocity, and it rains down. Where does it fall?
It goes up for about 30 seconds, and then it basically comes right back down on the atoll on Omelek Island. And so it makes a big splash. The bulk of the rocket comes down in one piece, and then it's sort of debris is scattered all over the atoll and in the coral reef around the tiny island. The tiny island, by the way, is the size of several New York City blocks. So it's not a big island.
Yes, it's a tropical island, such as, for example, you can imagine anyone dreaming to exist on this island. Many New Yorker cartoons over decades have shown a man with a beard standing on an island about this size. It rains down on Omelek, and everyone is crushed and disappointed that it didn't work the first time. But there's reason to expect that you'll fail the first time. Is that correct, Eric?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a private company, and so they hadn't spent hundreds of millions of dollars and had thousands of people working on this to test everything and make sure everything was right. They had gone fast with the idea that they were going to launch the rocket, get some real world test data, and then fix the problem, and then build the second one and learn from that. And so the idea was that there was a chance of failure. They accepted that, and they got their wish.
Right. The now well-known Elon Musk, failure is an option, is one of his proverbs. They pile into a barge that visits the island. Some people fly over, and they immediately start a scavenger hunt. What are they looking for?
Well, they're collecting pieces of the rocket to try to understand what had gone wrong. It's pretty standard in aerospace as you go out and there's no black box in a rocket like in an airplane, but if you collect enough pieces, you can see what burnt badly, what's destroyed, and you can sort of pinpoint things. I mean, that's just kind of standard practice, and you want to clean up your mess anyway, of course, because they were going to continue to use this as a launch site. They had a pretty good idea of what had gone wrong, but this was just kind of what you do when you have an accident.
It was a fuel leak. That's what went wrong. And it's something they immediately believed they could address. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was a fuel leak. And what had happened is they had left the rocket out in this tropical environment. Kwajalein is pretty near the equator. And so it's humid. You get sea breeze. There's no protection from the sea breeze on this tiny island. And it eventually had corroded one of the bolts. And there was a fuel leak leading down to the countdown. And that fuel caught fire, around the same time the rocket engine ignited.
Worth mentioning at this point that Elon Musk's leadership is inspirational. It also includes Elon Musk's wish to identify who did something wrong and to speak about it. And that caused tension immediately afterwards. in SpaceX. So we're going to go back to the beginning of SpaceX. This launch fails. However, that is part of the program. There will be a second launch soon enough once they correct everything and go back to Omelek Island. The book is Liftoff, Elon Musk and the Desperate Early Days that Launched SpaceX. The word desperate is applicable here because we're looking at a privately funded company by a man who has an idea while driving on the Long Island Expressway. Let this be a lesson to the future. If you're on the Long Island Expressway and you think, why not go to Mars? It might require your whole fortune and most of your life to devote yourself to that concept. But that's exactly the way you tell the story, Eric. Is that the way Musk tells the story on the Long Island Expressway?
I mean, I think he thought he would go faster than he did. It's been 20 years, more than 20 years since he had that idea in 2001. But yeah, I mean, that's how he tells the story. He's like, I was just thinking about what I was going to do next. He'd kind of ended his relationship with PayPal. And he was sitting on a few $100 million, and he was a young guy, about 30 years old and bright, obviously, and ambitious, and was trying to figure out what he was going to do next. And he looked around and thought that the space industry was ripe for disruption.
The disruption, though, required Elon Musk to educate himself. So sometimes I think he's sitting in his cubicle reading fundamental books about being an astrophysicist or a mechanical engineer, an electronics engineer. Is he a quick study? Does he talk about being a quick study?
Yeah, and other people around him say that as well. Like it's not unheard of for people to come into the space industry and really immerse themselves. They read fundamental books like Ignition, and other things like that to get a fundamentals of rocket science and try to pick it up. Because one of the interesting things about building rockets is that you learn by doing rather than reading about it. And so, you can jump in and get a pretty good education. So yeah, I mean, he's a quick study, and he applied himself to learning everything he could about, the fundamentals of rocketry and aerospace engineering.
He applied himself to donating or being a philanthropist for or supporting certain activities like Mars Oasis, or the X Prize on Mars, other ideas that were commonplace in the first part of the 21st century. However, in February of 2002 is my note here, and any winter of 2002 in California, he brings together experts to talk about founding a company. I think I hear amusement in the room. Is that right, Eric? Many people have tried and nobody's succeeded at this point of being a private launch company.
Yeah, Musk had been reading books, and he'd also been talking to a lot of people. And so he had money and he knew some people. And he sort of talked up Mike Griffin, who would eventually become NASA's administrator in the 2000s, a few years later. And so he gathered together a lot of the leading people in the space industry to kind of sound them out about his idea to start a rocket company. And a lot of the people in the room he wanted to try to hire. And this story was told to me by Chris Thompson, who would go on to become the vice president of structures at SpaceX. But he basically said that Elon had this meeting and he was laughed out of the room when he suggested he was going to. This was in a hotel in Los Angeles.
Yes, he offered 5 jobs. Only 2 of them were taken up. You mentioned Mr. Thompson, and we've mentioned Mr. Mueller. So Mueller's employee 1, Thompson's employee 2. It's May of 2002. Is that right?
Yes.
Right. May of 2002. They name it the Space Exploration Technologies, which is a terrible name.
Yes.
So who comes up with SpaceX? Whose idea is that?
Right. So they were calling it SET along the way. And that is rather Space Exploration Technologies. And that is rather a cumbersome name. So at one point, Elon himself came up with the name SpaceX that summer sometime. And so they went from SET to SpaceX, which is
again, this has the feel of Tom Swift Jr., the Hardy Boys. Let's build a rocket and go to the moon. They take residence in what I presume was an empty building in El Segundo, 13,000 square feet, put a bunch of desks in, some computers. Did they favor PCs or Apples in those days? Do we know? Did they have Macs or PCs?
They had PCs, yeah.
PCs. And they start hiring. Koenigsmann is one of them. He becomes the chief engineer. But what's important now is this is a business. This isn't money one way. Musk is devoting, Eric's reporting, about half of his worldly fortune, which is sizable, about $100 million, And we learn later that Musk was thinking 3 flights. I can afford 3 flights. I can pay for and inspire 3 flights. He has a very able assistant named Mary Beth Brown, who pays the bills and pretty much acts like Wendy for the boys. That's the way I picture this. Musk is Peter Pan, the Lost Boys. There are pirates, sometimes we could call them the Air Force, sometimes we could call them NASA. And they're in this large facility. Do they have the equipment right away? Are they making it up on computers? What are the first months like?
So the first months are initially designing the rocket and then figuring out what you're going to build. And so the 2 big differences here, I think what SpaceX was trying to do and what had typically come before is, number one, they didn't have a government contract to build this rocket. So no one was paying them their costs for all this design work. They were only going to get paid when they sold launch contracts primarily. So they wanted to get to launch as quickly as possible because that's when they could start getting return on all of the money they were spending. And the second thing was that, they did not want to build a rocket by buying all the components from different suppliers. So typically, if you wanted to build a rocket in the United States, you would buy your engine from Aerojet Rocketdyne, and you would buy your structures maybe from Boeing, and you'd buy your flight software from Draper, and all this. And what Musk wanted to try to do was build as much of that in-house. It's called vertical integration. It's a way to keep costs down and go faster because you're not waiting on suppliers for parts and things like that. The challenge, of course, is that you actually got to build those things that are very specialized components. And so some of the early things they were doing in those months is they were trying to figure out, okay, what really can we build in-house and what should we outsource? And so they made the decision that they were going to build the Merlin engine, design it and build it in-house. And that's what Tom Mueller did. And then they were going to, initially at least, they were going to buy things like tanks, fuel tanks, propellant tanks. They were going to go, buy those. And so that's what they were doing kind of that fall and winter, is going around to suppliers to find out what they could need and when they could get it.
And then they discovered they needed a test site, and Los Angeles area wasn't going to do because they made big black smoky clouds that were very unfriendly to the neighborhood. So they wind up in McGregor, Texas. Was that an accident? Was it just serendipity?
It was kind of serendipity. I mean, they had looked around the country, and I think that was sort of down on their list. That they happened to be speaking at Purdue University. Elon and Tim Buzza and Tom Mueller were there to talk to students, to try to hire students. And there was the director of the engineering lab, the aerospace lab there, had worked at McGregor for a company called Bale Aerospace. And he told them about McGregor and said they should check it out. So actually they took Elon's private jet directly from Indiana and Purdue down to McGregor, Texas to check out the site.
And that becomes the first of the many test sites for the Merlin engine and the Kestrel engine. The book is Eric Berger's Liftoff, Elon Musk in the desperate early days that launched SpaceX. We're going back to Omelek for Flight 2 in 2007. The spring again, March of 2007. We're back at Omelek Island. The crew is gathered again for the second flight. This is important because they've learned their lessons of failure. They believe they can go forward. There are some details, however, we need to introduce. Eric, before we set the rocket up and light the candle, what is the slosh concern? What are the baffles for the second stage?
So the idea is that as you go up in a rocket, your fuel drains down, right? It's liquid oxygen, it's kerosene, and the tank's empty, and you've got to sort of somehow manage it to make sure that the fuel keeps coming out, and so you pressurize that space and sort of it comes down. And it's less of an issue with the first stage, but when you get to the second stage, you're in microgravity, so you don't have gravity pulling down on the rocket, so sort of pulling the fuel down toward the engine. And especially the second stage is also going sideways relative to the surface of the Earth. So one of the big debates they had at SpaceX before that second flight was, on this second stage, which takes off about 2.5 or 3 minutes after launch, do you need some kind of mechanism there to help that fuel flow propellant flow toward the engine. And that would have involved basically putting in slosh baffles. Now, the challenge with that is the second stage is pretty delicate already, because you don't want to have much mass, because every pound you put on the second stage, you're taking away from a pound you could put on a satellite or payload. And so you want to maximize the amount of stuff you can carry to orbit. So slosh baffles are kind of like, it's almost like a ship in a bottle, like very delicate, working inside there. And so they decided to not use slosh baffles because 7 of the 8 or 6 of the 7 computer models they'd run on it had basically shown that this slosh, basically the fuel sloshing back and forth and not going down toward the engine, would not be an issue.
Also, weight is critical, because they've already understood that the Merlin engine is not getting the thrust they expected in their computer models. And every pound they're losing, or every 100 pounds they're losing, mean a lot for the commercial enterprise that they're running here. They've got to sell this to people who want to pay for money to put their payloads into orbit. We mentioned Gwynne Shotwell here, who is the president of SpaceX today, but she's the sales division all by herself. She's an experienced person in big space, and she is making presentations around the world. They have customers. They have Malaysia for a customer. They have NASA for a customer. They have the military for a customer, but they've got to deliver on their promise of how much they can lift into space. So Eric makes the excellent point that they did a list of what are the 10 things we're worried about. And slosh didn't make it, Eric. It was the 11th. It was the 11th on the list. And
Yep.
has that become a proverb at SpaceX? Check number 11.
Yeah, their list of concerns now doesn't go to 10, it goes to 11. And so one of the quotes from Elon in the book is always go to 11, the play on the movie Spinal Tap.
It's good advice. I will take it to heart. Always go to 11. So we're back on Omelek Island. Buzza and Koenigsmann give up their Christmas with their families and working very hard. They do a wet dress rehearsal. One of the things I learned from Eric they've added are sensors and testing mechanisms that didn't exist for the first flight, because Musk is faster, better, cheaper. That's Musk. It's his money, and he's spending it to get to orbit, because once he gets to orbit, he thinks he has something to sell, and he's already thinking about Falcon 5 and Falcon 9. You say he's multitasking. I just don't think he can concentrate very long on one problem. He needs several at a time. How does he think about himself when he starts talking about Falcon 9 as they're preparing to launch Falcon 1?
You know, he is very good at focusing on the details of problems right in front of him, focusing on sort of the alligators closest to the canoe, if you will. But he also is always thinking ahead. So as they're building the Falcon 1, he's thinking about a Falcon 5 or a Falcon 9. And, you know, as later on, as they're flying the Falcon 9, he's thinking about Falcon Heavy and Starship. So he's always got the big picture in his mind, and sort of hires well to let his teams focus on those problems. I say most immediate problems, most immediate challenges.
The computer shuts down the 1st. There's an abort on the 21st. Everybody's anxious. They have to detank. They take risks. Buzza is taking the biggest risk because he's launch director. So they're ready to blast off, and the first stage works. Hooray. At this point in the book, I knew there was too much left, and so there was going to be trouble. I was waiting for it. What was the trouble, Eric?
So those gosh darn slosh baffles, the slosh in the second stage, they hadn't put the baffles in, and a couple minutes into the second stage's flight, it starts spinning out of control. And so they had not put a real satellite on this mission. It was still a test flight, but it spun out of control, and they lost it. And so, but they didn't really see that as a big setback, John, because getting that first stage engine to light and fly its full mission profile, and getting the second engine to light, you figured you could solve the second stage slosh baffle problem pretty simple. And so, you know, as Tim Buzza, the launch director, told me on Omelek, they had a tradition of getting drunk when they had success, and they had a tradition of getting drunk when they had failure. They had a celebration that night because they thought they were really close to orbit. This is March of 2007. Company was less than 5 years old, and they thought they were pretty close.
Yes, and I did too, although I do note that they do a lot of celebratory drinking or mournful drinking at the same time. although it seems to be mostly beer when they're out at Omelek. It's
Yes.
stronger matters when they're close to Los Angeles. All right, so they've had two failures now, but they did reach orbit. They reached.
No. They reached space. They flew well above 100 kilometers, but their dummy satellite and payload did not reach orbit.
All right, so there's a distinction that Eric makes here. You need to reach space, but reaching orbit means that you've got to inject something into a stable orbit. Is that correct, Eric? So that
Yeah,
back down.
yeah. And there's a general sense in the space industry that until you reach orbit, you're not really a real rocket company.
A real rocket company. It is now 2008. We're back on Omelek for the first stage. There's a lot of drama in between in Eric's books, and I recommend it highly. We don't have time for anecdotes here. However, they are now organized on Kwajalein and on Omelek so that they have their own barge, the Peregrine Falcons, the catamaran takes them back and forth. They have some luxuries that never existed before, and we need to introduce a young man named Zach Dunn. Who is he?
Zach Dunn is a young engineer, just like a lot of people hired him out of college, and just very energetic propulsion guy, engine guy, worked with Jeremy Holman beneath Tom Muller, and was just out there getting after it as much as he could, putting everything he had into the company.
Yes, he dreamed of joining a rocket company, and he interned and he went to college and he worked at SpaceX, and now he's Jeremy Holman's deputy because Holman has, I believe, left the company, but he appointed Dunn as his successor so that Muller would have a lieutenant to back him up on all the details. And what is Dunn's specialty? Is it propulsion? Is that where he's working?
Yeah, he's worked very closely with the engine, and he ends up, with all of the experience of being an intern in there several months with responsibility for the first stage performance. So he's a responsible engineer for the Falcon 9 or Falcon 1 first stage. That's at SpaceX. It's a meritocracy in that sense. If you work hard and show some ability, you get put in the line of responsibility very quickly.
It's August 3rd, 2008. The world of capitalism is about to collapse. Eric mentions it peripherally, that what's going to happen next is a crash around the world. However, at the same time, the rocket lifts off at 3:34 p.m., having had a thunderstorm pass overhead. The Merlin engine on the first stage works perfectly. And then we have what is described politely as an anomaly. What is it?
So what happened is that they had made some changes to the engine, and they had not accounted for a little bit of residual propellant in the engine. And so the first stage starts separating from the second stage as expected, but then unexpectedly that first stage engine relights with this little bit of extra propellant. And that's enough for the first stage to fly up and bump the second stage a little bit and knock it out of kilter. And that kills the mission. And this was a huge disappointment because they had been so close on the flight previously, and they had put all kinds of customers on this mission. The DoD was on this mission. NASA was on this mission. Commercial customers. I mean, they were flying the ashes of Scotty from Star Trek as a part of the Celestis mission to put him into orbit in death. And it all came crashing back.
And the failure this time is profound because I mentioned that Musk had budgeted for 3. Also, I mentioned the markets are collapsing. So refinancing or extending the finance of one company is difficult, but 2, Tesla is also being developed by the same team, Elon Musk and his colleagues at the same time. So do they have the money for 4 tests? Elon Musk brings the whole crew back together in the headquarters back in Los Angeles, and he's going to give a speech. You have a wonderful scene, Eric, of people sitting on the table, and they expected to close down that day. Was that the mood in the room?
Yeah, that was definitely the mood. And this was a day after that failure. And actually some of the employees were still back on Kwajalein, and they told me they weren't even sure if there was going to be airfare for them to fly home, right? They're going to have to buy their own tickets. But Musk gets up and in this meeting back in California and says, this was unfortunate, but I believe in you guys, and we're going to give it one more go. We've got the rocket parts out there in the factory for one more rocket, the fourth one. Let's do it in 6 weeks. And everyone knows it's the last chance. They're out of money. They don't have any more rockets. And so they've got to make that fourth one work.
Yes, and they need 6 months, but he gives them 6 weeks. So here goes the dramatic conclusion of the book is Liftoff, Elon Musk in the desperate early days that launched SpaceX. Eric Berger is the author. I'm John Batchelor. It is now 2008. The markets have collapsed. The dollar is damaged. The money markets are damaged. There's no money anywhere, and we're not clear that Wall Street can stay open. I'm just mentioning that's at the same time that Elon Musk says, I have enough money to make one more test if you can put it together. So very quickly, the whole team gathers. This is very much, again, like Tom Swift here. They'll gather together and we're going to build that rocket and go to the moon. Okay, fine. They have a limited amount of time. They assemble the first and second stage, but they don't have the time that it takes to get it by barge out to Omelek, which would take a month. So how do they convince the Air Force to give them a C-17? What's the magic, Eric?
The magic was they had contacts in the Air Force, and a guy named Brian Beldy and others were calling around to try to find a transportation. And it was about $500,000 for the trip. But as you say, I mean, they didn't have 4 weeks to ship it out there. They needed it there in days. And so they were able to get a C-17 military transport hired, and it flew right over their headquarters in LA and landed at LAX. And they took the rocket down to the airport and loaded it on board. And as one of the employees told me, they could see these international jets, like sort of, it was a face at every window watching them as they were putting this rocket on the C-17. And they thought that maybe the passengers on board the commercial jets thought that there was a start of a war somewhere, because they were taking this big rocket to launch somewhere in a military jet.
Yes, and at this point in the story, I thought we're going to have a happy ending, but no, there's no happy ending. We pile onto the C-17, and because there's so many employees that have helped load, this is the first stage, and tie it down and wrap it with cellophane. They're going, about 20 of them, you estimate, Eric,
Yes.
get on board, and the Air Force pilots are good-natured about it, and they take off from Los Angeles, and they're flying first to Hawaii, and then they'll fly on to Kwajalein. And everybody seems to be content with the fact that this is going to work. We're going to get the first stage there in time. And now we introduce Altan. Who is Altan, and what is his experience that almost had, I think he almost had a heart attack.
Yeah, Bulent Altan is a young man from Turkey. He grew up in Germany, and he works for Hans Koenigsmann in the avionics. And he is up in the cockpit, just sort of talking to the pilots as they're coming into Honolulu, Hickam Air Force Base. And all of a sudden, they hear this huge popping sound from below.
The popping sound is the rocket imploding. Now, this requires a little explanation. There are pressure differentials inside the rocket and inside the aircraft at 30,000 feet or wherever the C-17 is flying. So everything is fine while they're in the air, but as they begin their descent, there's disaggregation going on. I think that's a word that Musk likes to use sometimes. And Altan and others recognize it right. They are done. They all know what they've done wrong right away, because they relied upon the Air Force's older manual about what the pressure would be like in the C-17. Did I read that correctly, Eric?
Yeah, they had followed the guidance of like the pressurization inside the C-17 hangar, basically the cargo area, at different altitudes of flight. And so you never want your rocket to have a lower pressure inside than outside, because rockets are designed to be pressurized, not the other way around. But they had gotten an older copy of the manual, and so as the airplane started descending toward Hawaii, the pressure outside the rocket, as the air pressure goes up, in the airplane, it goes up, and the rocket is still at a lower pressure from the higher cruising altitude, and it starts to crumple, basically like a soda can being crushed.
And what is to be done? First of all, you can sit there and watch the whole thing blow up and perhaps damage 20 people and the aircraft, or you can go to the pilots and say, by the way, we need you to climb back to altitude and give us time to solve this. And the pilots say, just like a Hollywood movie, Eric, well, fine, but we've only got 30 minutes fuel. So that's much. And that you report that gave them 10 minutes before they had to start the descent again. And
right. So the initial concern for the pilots and actually the loadmaster was, is this going to explode? Because they didn't know whether it was fueled or, but it wasn't. So they didn't have to ditch it. Like that was the first concern. Should we ditch the rocket so it doesn't damage the C-17? And then Bulent Altan goes back up to the cockpit and says, climb. And the pilots agree to it. And so they have about 10 minutes to try to equalize the pressure. And so it's basically like, the way it's configured, it's trying to breathe at the bottom of the pool through a long straw in terms of getting air pressure inside the rocket. And so the only solution is to open up the valves. The problem is that needs to be done manually. And so as the rocket is imploding, someone has to climb actually inside from the top of the booster. And that turns out to be Zach Dunn, this gung-ho propulsion guy, who actually crawls inside the rocket, tears up his back on sort of the equipment on the side of the rocket, and manages to open these valves and start to equalize the pressure. And that sort of temporarily saved the day because the rocket stops crumpling and sort of even starts popping back out as they go to land in Hawaii.
Meanwhile, they have a damaged first stage. They do get it to Kwajalein and they get it to Omelek, but they only have so much time to repair the first stage. At this point, Eric, I gave up. I just absolutely, I didn't know what was going to happen next in your book. And now they are going to be successful. They feel that they've had bad luck. I would have felt at this point that there was a Jonah on board, somebody that shipfaring superstition. And you remind me that rocket engineers and their colleagues are very superstitious. They have many details from those first launches that they still continue today on SpaceX. I believe a cloverleaf is one of them. Is that right, Eric? The cloverleaf is everything.
Yeah, they do. They did mission, like everyone else, they did mission patches for launches back then. And they just put a 4-leaf clover on that flight 4 of the Falcon 1 for the first time on the mission patch. And spoiler alert, it was successful. And so they've had a 4-leaf clover on every mission patch since.
All right. It is now 2008. The world is in a severe recession, depression, but we're on late September. Congress is arguing over bailing out America, and Falcon 1 is flying. It lifts off. We've been through this several times. The part I like, Eric, is when they reached orbit and they started screaming orbit at each other. Did that happen both in California and in Kwajalein? Did they yell back and forth, oh, orbit, orbit?
Well, what happened is there had been a small crew that had basically done the final preparations for the rocket on Omelek, and they had gone back to a tiny atoll nearby for launch because you couldn't be on Omelek during the launch because of what happened, obviously, on the first flight. And so those people get on a boat after launch and they come back to Kwajalein. And so the people from the launch control center in Kwajalein go running down to the pier where those people come, and they're just kind of scraping orbit back and forth at one another in this just jubilant celebration.
And what they put into orbit, by the way, is a satellite they've made up for a dummy load that they call RATSAT. Is that what they called it? RATSAT.
Yeah, and RAT comes from the first letter of the last names of 3 of the structure's engineers.
And it's in orbit today, and it'll be in orbit for several hundred years. Is that correct?
Yeah, RATSAT's in orbit. It's slowly degrading, but yeah, it'll be up there for a long time.
And that is the end of the beginning of SpaceX. It gets more exciting, and we're looking for the next edition from Eric Berger. But the first book is everything you want in Tom Swift Jr.'s stories. Liftoff, Elon Musk and the desperate early days that launched SpaceX. I'm John Batchelor.